are stories that sound unbelievable the moment you hear them. Stories so outrageous they almost collapse under their own weight. A man claims to have built a machine capable of bending time in his backyard. He says his evidence wasn't a photograph. It wasn't a blurry video. It wasn't a witness. It was a wrench. A simple metal wrench that vanished into thin air, then reappeared several seconds before it had been thrown. That claim should have been enough to dismiss the entire story. Instead, it was only the beginning. Because the man making these claims wasn't hiding in the shadows. He willingly told his story on national radio. Thousands listened. Electrical engineers wrote in. Physicists debated him. Amateur scientists tried recreating his machine. Then, just when he promised the world he'd reveal his newest and most powerful time machine, he disappeared. No dramatic farewell, no note, no announcement, just gone. Today, nearly 30 years later, people still argue over what really happened to Mike "Madman" Marcum. Was he an eccentric genius, a charismatic storyteller, a victim of his own obsession, or did he actually stumble onto something science wasn't ready to explain? Tonight, we're stepping into one of the strangest modern legends ever told. I am your host Malachi, and this is Stranger Things. If you're expecting the story of a polished scientist working inside a billion-dollar laboratory, you're listening to the wrong episode. Mike Marcum wasn't a professor. He wasn't backed by a university. He didn't have government grants or corporate funding. He wasn't wearing a white lab coat. He was just Mike, living in the Midwest during the early 1990s, working ordinary jobs. Fascinated by electricity, absolutely consumed by one impossible question: can time be manipulated? Like many great obsessions, nobody knows exactly where it began. Some say Mike became fascinated with Nikola Tesla's high-voltage experiments. Others believe he'd been reading speculative physics for years. Whatever lit the fuse, it eventually became an all-consuming fire. Most people fascinated with time travel read books, watch documentaries, debate paradoxes online. Mike decided to build one in his backyard, using junkyard parts and enough electricity to power a small neighborhood. If that sounds reckless, you're right. If it sounds impossible, that's exactly why so many people still remember his name. According to Mike's own account, his first design centered around an idea that sounds surprisingly simple. Two enormous electromagnetic coils, facing one another, connected to powerful transformers. The goal: create an intense electromagnetic field between them. He believed that if the magnetic fields became strong enough, space itself might distort. Not unlike the way massive objects warp space-time under Einstein's theory of general relativity. Now, let's pause here. Einstein absolutely demonstrated that gravity and space-time are connected. Modern physics agrees with that. But creating measurable distortions in space-time requires unimaginable amounts of energy. Black holes, neutron stars, entire planets. Not a homemade collection of welding equipment and scavenged transformers. That's where Mike departed from accepted science. He believed there might be shortcuts, unknown interactions between magnetic fields and time itself. Whether he misunderstood the physics or whether he believed he'd discovered something everyone else had missed is impossible to know. But Mike wasn't interested in theory anymore. He wanted results. Then came the experiment that transformed Mike Marcum from an anonymous tinkerer into a legend. As Mike later described it during an interview, he placed a metal screw, or, in some retellings, a wrench, inside the space between the electromagnetic coils. He activated the machine. Immediately, something happened. The object disappeared, not exploded, not launched across the yard, not melted, disappeared. Seconds later, it allegedly fell back into existence. Behind him, Mike insisted something impossible had occurred. He claimed the object had vanished from normal space, only to return moments later. Even stranger, he believed the object had returned before it should have, as if it had briefly left time itself. Could that actually happen? There is absolutely no independently verified evidence that it did. No measurements, no recordings, no physical proof, only Mike's testimony. Yet what happened next is undeniably real, because Mike became convinced enough by what he'd witnessed that he decided to build something much larger, much more powerful, and much more dangerous. There's an unfortunate reality about high-voltage experimentation. Electricity isn't cheap, especially not when you're trying to generate enormous magnetic fields. Mike needed transformers, lots of them. Industrial transformers, the kind found mounted on utility poles. Unfortunately, those don't exactly appear at yard sales. Police reports from the time indicate that electrical transformers began disappearing around Mike's hometown. Authorities eventually connected the thefts to Mike Marcum. He later admitted he had stolen transformers because he couldn't afford to buy them. This wasn't some elaborate criminal enterprise. It was one obsessed man trying to gather enough electrical power to chase an impossible dream. The consequences were predictable: power outages, damaged infrastructure, arrest, legal trouble. Yet none of it seemed to slow him down. If anything, it strengthened his conviction. Then came the night that launched Mike Marcum into paranormal history. In 1995, he called into one of the biggest late-night radio shows in America, hosted by the legendary Art Bell. If you grew up fascinated by UFOs, ghosts, government conspiracies, or impossible mysteries, you probably know that name. For millions of insomniacs, truck drivers, night shift workers, and curious minds, Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM was where the impossible came alive. Some callers described alien encounters, others claimed psychic abilities. A few sounded completely unhinged. Then Mike called. He didn't sound frantic. He didn't sound delusional. He sounded matter-of-fact, almost amused, like someone describing how they'd repaired a lawnmower. He calmly explained how he'd built his machine, how he'd watched objects disappear, how he'd believed he was getting closer to sending something larger. Art Bell listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, then invited Mike back for a longer conversation. Listeners were captivated, phone lines lit up, some laughed, others were fascinated. A surprising number of engineers wrote to Bell saying Mike's descriptions of transformers, coils, and electrical systems sounded technically competent. Not proof, but enough to make people wonder whether Mike really had built exactly what he claimed, just not necessarily a time machine. As Mike described the machine in greater detail, listeners began imagining something that sounded almost cinematic. Massive transformers humming with barely contained energy, towering electromagnetic coils. Arcs of electricity leaping through the air like gigantic Jacob's ladders. The smell of ozone, the roar of thousands of volts. The kind of setup that looked less like a scientific instrument and more like something Dr. Frankenstein would build if he had access to a scrapyard. Mike claimed standing near the machine made the hairs on his arms rise. Electronic devices malfunctioned. Static electricity filled the air. Neighbors reportedly heard strange humming sounds. Whether every one of those details happened exactly as described is difficult to verify. Stories grow over time, especially on the internet. But enough independent listeners remembered Mike describing the immense electrical forces involved that the image has become inseparable from the legend. It wasn't just a machine, it was an obsession made visible, a monument to one man's refusal to believe the impossible was impossible. After the interview aired, letters poured in. Some offered advice, others mocked him. A handful claimed to have performed similar electrical experiments. Then, something unexpected happened. Mike announced he wasn't finished. The first machine had only been a prototype. He was already designing a second machine, one capable, not of sending wrenches, not of sending screws, but of sending a person. That revelation electrified Art Bell's audience. Was Mike serious? Had he gone too far? Or was history quietly unfolding in someone's backyard while the scientific community laughed from a distance? No one knew, but everyone wanted to hear what came next. Mike promised he'd return to Coast AM. He would describe the new machine, explain the improvements, and perhaps attempt the impossible. Then, something happened. Mike Marcum vanished from the public eye. If Mike's first machine was assembled from scavenged electrical equipment, the second was supposed to be something entirely different. According to Mike, he had learned from his earlier experiments. The new design would be larger, more stable, more powerful. He reportedly acquired heavier transformers, industrial electrical components, and stronger coils. Friends who claimed to have seen parts of the machine later described a tangled forest of copper wiring, steel framing, and high-voltage equipment that looked more like a power substation than a home experiment. Whether those descriptions became exaggerated over the years is impossible to know. But one thing is certain. Mike believed he was getting closer, much closer. During conversations with Art Bell, Mike hinted that the next experiment wouldn't involve tools, it would involve himself. Imagine hearing that in the mid-1990s. The internet was still in its infancy. Social media didn't exist. News spread through word of mouth, magazines and radio. Thousands of listeners became invested in the story. Some worried Mike would electrocute himself. Others believed they might be witnessing one of history's greatest scientific breakthroughs. Most simply couldn't wait to hear what happened next. Then, nothing. Mike stopped calling. The scheduled follow-up interviews never materialized. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. Art Bell occasionally mentioned listeners asking about Mike. No one seemed to know where he'd gone. And because Mike had never been a celebrity, there wasn't a team of reporters looking for him. He simply faded from public view. For many people, that was the end of the story. A curious footnote from the golden age of paranormal radio. Another eccentric inventor who eventually moved on with life. But for others, the silence wasn't the ending. It was the beginning. Because once someone disappears after claiming they're about to test a homemade time machine, people begin filling in the blanks. Rumors spread quickly in paranormal circles. One version claimed Mike had accidentally killed himself during an experiment. Another insisted he'd been arrested again, Some believed government agencies confiscated his equipment. Others suggested he intentionally disappeared to avoid ridicule. Those explanations are grounded in reality. They happen. People abandon unusual projects every day. Lives change. Money runs out. Dreams fade. But there was another rumor, one far stranger than the rest. It began with whispers among Art Bell listeners, then spread across internet forums, then became almost inseparable from Mike's legend. The rumor claimed Mike had succeeded, not perfectly, not intentionally, but enough to send himself somewhere else. Years after Mike's original appearances, Coast to Coast AM received another intriguing call. This caller wasn't introducing himself as Mike Marcum. Instead, he claimed something extraordinary. He said he'd met Mike, not the young Mike listeners remembered, an older Mike, decades older. According to the caller, this older man claimed he had successfully traveled through time, but the trip had gone catastrophically wrong. Rather than arriving precisely where he intended, he allegedly emerged years into the future, disoriented, unable to recreate the original machine, unable to return home. Imagine the psychological weight of that story. If true, you don't become famous, you don't win awards, you don't rewrite history, you simply become stranded. A man out of time, living quietly among people who have no reason to believe your impossible story. It's haunting, it's cinematic, and there is absolutely no evidence that it actually happened. The caller never provided proof, no photographs, no documents, no names that could be independently verified. Just a story, a fascinating story, one that listeners have debated ever since. Here's where the documented record becomes much more interesting. Years later, Mike Marcum did resurface. Not dramatically, not through a government press conference, not with blueprints for a functioning time machine. He appeared in interviews and documentaries discussing his earlier experiments. He looked older, more reflective, less frantic. He still maintained that unusual events had occurred around his machines. He still believed he had observed phenomena that conventional science couldn't explain. But he also acknowledged that many stories circulating online had become wildly exaggerated. That's an important distinction. Internet folklore often grows like a snowball rolling downhill. Each retelling adds another layer. A missing detail becomes certainty, a rumor becomes fact, a possibility becomes history. Separating documented events from decades of embellishment becomes incredibly difficult. Now we arrive at the question every listener has probably been asking. Could Mike Marcum have accidentally built a time machine? According to modern physics, the answer is almost certainly no. Einstein's equations do allow for fascinating possibilities. Time dilation is real. Astronauts experience tiny differences in elapsed time because of their speed and Earth's gravity. Particles have demonstrated effects that seem astonishing. The universe is far stranger than everyday experience suggests. But creating a macroscopic machine capable of transporting people through time would require conditions far beyond anything Mike possessed. Exotic matter, immense gravitational forces, energy on a scale humanity has never harnessed. Nothing about his backyard workshop approaches those requirements. So why does the story refuse to disappear? Because something else happened. Not necessarily in physics, in people. Mike inspired curiosity. He represented the dream that ordinary individuals can still ask impossible questions, that science isn't only performed in billion-dollar laboratories, that history sometimes begins with someone willing to sound ridiculous. History is filled with people mocked before being proven right. It's also filled with people who sincerely believed impossible things. Determining which category Mike belongs in remains difficult. Today, Mike Marcum occupies a unique place in modern folklore. He's discussed alongside stories of mysterious disappearances, time slips, the Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk Project, and countless tales of people claiming to have brushed against the edges of reality, whether deserved or not. His name has become shorthand for homemade genius bordering on obsession. Engineers still analyze the descriptions of his machines. Physics enthusiasts debate whether unusual electromagnetic effects might have fooled observers. Skeptics point to faulty memories, confirmation bias, and the tendency of legends to grow over time. Believers ask one simple question: if Mike was lying, why keep telling the story after all these years? It's a fair question, but sincerity alone isn't proof. Someone can honestly describe an experience they believe happened without understanding what actually caused it. That's why this mystery remains unsolved, not because the evidence is overwhelming, but because the evidence is incomplete. Maybe Mike Marcum never bent time. Maybe his machine was nothing more than an extraordinarily dangerous electrical experiment. Maybe every strange event had a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting to be discovered. Or maybe, somewhere in the chaos of sparks, magnetic fields, and impossible ambition, he witnessed something no one has been able to reproduce. History often remembers the polished inventors, the celebrated scientists, the Nobel Prize winners. But sometimes it remembers the dreamers, the outsiders, the people willing to ask questions everyone else laughed at. Mike "Madman" Marcum may never appear in a physics textbook. His machine may never be replicated. His claims may never be verified. Yet decades after he first picked up the phone and called Art Bell, we're still talking about him. Still wondering, still asking the same question: what if? Just for one impossible moment, a wrench disappeared, and tomorrow looked back. I am Malachi, and this has been Stranger Things. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, sometimes the strangest stories are the ones that refuse to fade away.